after Trump's election, I wrote a book about Trump and his cabinet, and then as we kind of moved through the process, I became interested in this question of how did Trump get elected, right? How did that happen? Because this is such a bad player. It's so easily criticized in so many legitimate ways. And initially I started thinking I was going to look at the Republican Party and the degeneration of the Republican Party. I even had a book deal to look at the Republican Party. And I went back to folks and I said, the more I look at this is really not a story of the Republican Party. It's a story of the Democratic Party. And then I started to really spend a lot of time looking at, kind of where the Democratic Party went off the rails. And the interesting thing about it is that you were talking a moment ago about the Dixiecrats and the Southerners. Roosevelt wasn't as good as he should have been on race. He made compromises along the way that were, I think, both unnecessary and unwise.
So
you can look also at the Japanese internment. You look at a lot of things that Roosevelt got wrong, and I write about that in my book. But the interesting thing was that one of the things he got right was World War II, right? A recognition that you could unite the country against fascism, and you could actually get pretty much everybody on board to go beat Hitler, right? That was a remarkable thing, and that unity that was developed during World War II could have been the force that you came out of World War II. You came out of that moment and said, now we're going to solve a lot of other problems. We're going to get the economics right. We're going to keep a unity of the people. We're going to address Jim Crow segregation. We are going to address the subjugation of women in the workplace and other settings. And the person who proposed to do that was Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president. Yeah. And I remind people that in 1944, Henry Wallace was seeking a second term as vice president. He came within a smidgen, a tiny set of votes at the Democratic National Convention of being renominated for vice president. Had he been renominated for vice president, he would have become president of the United States. He would have become president of the United States as a supporter of economic and social and racial justice, and with a clear vision of maintaining the unity coming out of World War II. And you say, well, how would he have done better than Truman? Well, here's the argument, simple argument. He understood, Truman was thrown into the presidency, had virtually no idea what he was doing, right? And then you had Henry Wallace, who was saying, look, here's what we're going to do. We are going to create 7 million new jobs, right? We're going to come out of World War II with a whole program to create ultimately tens of millions of new jobs. We're going to invest in housing. We're going to invest in programs for the returning GIs. We're going to invest in programs that make sure that our industries keep functioning. And we're going to do this by promoting, as best we can, with a recognition that we're dealing with tough other countries around the world, but as best we can, a future that is based on diplomacy and cooperation rather than a new Cold War. And that was controversial. A lot of people didn't like that. But I would argue that had Wallace been able to maintain that New Deal vision and begin to address some of the deep divisions in the United States around race and around gender and other issues, and I think he could have, and I think he had the vision for it, you wouldn't have had the setbacks that Democrats had in 1946. That means that you would have not had the Taft-Hartley law. You would have kept strong unions. By keeping strong unions and by actually building and kind of renewing the New Deal in the post-World War II era, I think you had the possibility of an incredible breakthrough. And remember, Britain had that breakthrough. After World War II, what did Britain do? They got national health care. They got, many of the programs that to this day define Britain as more of a social welfare state than the United States. So did other countries across Europe and around the world. The United States was that close. And what stopped us from getting there? It was the Democratic Party, right? The Democratic Party chose not to take that leap. Now you say, okay, one mistake, 1944, could have done better. No. Again and again and again, when progressives stepped forward to try and actually sometimes did take leadership, they were dramatically undermined by the corporate interests within the party. Famously, in 1972, when Richard Nixon was running for re-election, George McGovern actually got the nomination as a genuine progressive, right? What happened? Democrats for Nixon. There literally was a national group called Democrats for Nixon that governors and senators and members of the House supported. Democratic leaders actually campaigned against their own candidate, right? To make sure that that didn't happen, right? And so what I would tell you again and again and again is the Democratic Party has undermined its own possibility to become, this party of transformation and a forward-looking party in the United States. And I think that's what Sanders came up against in 2016 and in 2020. There are those who will say, well, okay, then why don't you just give up on the Democratic Party, right? Why don't you, look for an alternative? And I never discourage people from looking at alternatives, right? I think multi-party politics is a very healthy thing. And I would love it if America had multi-party politics, but our system is stacked against it. Our system is stacked structurally. Our media is stacked as well. So we end up in a situation where multi-party politics becomes very, very difficult. So really the battle continues for the soul of the Democratic Party. And it is ongoing. It is brutal. The frustrating thing is that while the corporate interests know full well that they are always in a war for the soul of the Democratic Party, I worry sometimes that progressives aren't always aware of that.
Yeah, the problem is that when you've been literally knocked down and beaten down so many times, it's easy. What they expect is that you'll just move along. And what I've said for a lot of the people who were very green, if you will, at the time, I know I was politics was always a part of my life, but, Bernie's run in 2015 was what really got me into this in a very, a deep-rooted kind of way. And you learned a lot of things that you didn't like or were never going to like. And so as a result, you can go one of two ways. You're either going to look at the system and say, it's too corrupt, I can't get involved. Or you learn how the system works and do everything you can to build that cohesive power. The big disconnect that we're seeing today, which Jen and I talk about constantly on this program, is that the only thing that's going to save us in this country is not the Democratic Party, it's the labor movement. Now,
that's right.
If the labor movement happens through the Democratic Party, so be it.
We're trying.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to get them to get back together with labor. Like that would be the ideal scenario.
Yep.
But I feel like ultimately, that's the problem. And until they really get, and I don't mean get back with like union heads, like until they really get with labor, where are they going?
Yeah.
Well, first off, labor has to be strengthened, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's excess powerlessness in many cases here, right? Where labor has been so beaten down in so many states that that it is you have a rebuilding process that has to occur. Now that should be connected to the pursuit of power, right? Democrats ought to be militantly pro-labor, right? And be there when labor's in a fight. Obviously, with the situation with the railroad workers, you saw that wasn't the case. But that's not the only case. You see it again and again and again.
Yes.
And, it's a very interesting thing. Again, we started talking about Scott Walker in Wisconsin here and the Wisconsin Supreme Court election. We've moved through a lot of other territory, but we can go back to that. Think about this. In 2010, Scott Walker, a very serious, extreme right-wing Republican politician, rides a wave of Republican votes in that cycle, that year, into the governorship of Wisconsin. He gets a legislature that is on his side. What is the first thing he does? The very first thing he does is attack labor, right? Why did he do that? Because he hates labor? Scott Walker could care less about organized labor. Scott Walker attacked labor because public employee unions, in particular the teachers union and the state workers and county and municipal workers, were the backbone of the Democratic Party, right? So he attacked labor because he wanted to weaken the Democratic Party. He knew exactly what he was doing. There was no lack of clarity at all. There was no, blinking of the eyes. They were working on that within days after he was elected. Why? Because Wisconsin's a battleground state. If he didn't weaken labor, ultimately the Democrats would come back. Because he weakened labor, the Democrats in some cases still haven't come back as regards to the legislative level in Wisconsin. And so it was a brilliant move. And why won't Democrats recognize that on the flip side? When they come to power, shouldn't the very first thing that Democrats do, right once they get in the door, is strengthen those who brought them to power, right? Strengthen labor, strengthen, and yes, work closely with and strengthen civil rights groups and civil liberties groups. There is a rubric of organizations that are supportive of, basically a democratic victory. Now, unfortunately, when Democrats come to power, too frequently in cycle after cycle after cycle, they may say the right things about labor, but do they actually do it? And what we see is that they don't. And in this regard, I'm going to defend Joe Biden. He's better than his predecessors, right? I mean, he's at least somewhat more sympathetic to labor than some previous Democratic presidents. Look at Bill Clinton.
Oh,
I mean, with all due respect, Bill Clinton comes to power in 1992, and he's got this very strongly Democratic Congress. What does he use his power to do? The North American Free Trade Agreement, the GATT agreement, moving the U.S. into the WTO. It's just unbelievable.
Who was one of the biggest advocates for NAFTA, normal trade relations with China, the crime bill?
Yes.
I'm just pointing it out.
No.
The reality is that even if listen, Biden is what he is, but I think that the political climate has become so economic populist. You could again, it's like with Wasserman Schultz down here. It's if we had the type of campaign when Jen ran in 20 to really inform the public that Wasserman Schultz was at the forefront of pushing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to even note something like that today would essentially get you kicked out of public office, because the country is just not having that anymore. They're very well aware of the systems that are in place that have completely screwed them over. These free trade agreements. No, the only thing about these trade agreements is how can we more or less crush labor even harder in regards to, we want the wages to be as low as can possibly be by making sure that we create a bigger and bigger serfs class. And I do think that there is sort of this. We had a guest on our show not too long ago. You've probably heard of him, Gavin Mario Wax. He's the head of the New York Young Republicans. He's the one who held that whole rally for Trump in Manhattan a little over a week ago. But what was very interesting about the conversation we had with him is that the social issues are going to be what they're going to be. Interestingly enough, he wasn't keen on the whole abortion thing, thinking that a woman should have the right to choose, which I think is definitely more libertarian, more of a generational thing. But the economic populism, there was a lot of agreement there. And I do think that there is something to be said for the ability to divide people on very wedge issue lines. Whereas when we talk about the key core issues, like the fact that Clinton is responsible for NAFTA, normal trade relations with China, the Telecom Act, the crime bill, the worst one of all, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, when people are aware of these things, they say, I don't give a damn who passed it. I just know it sucks. And it sucks for labor. It sucks for working people. I hear people complain about, on the right, I hear people complain about unions all the time. I never hear them complain about labor. And I think the reason that is because they associate unions with union bosses and not union rank and file. I think that's the major disconnect. Do you agree?
I think that, look, the fact of the matter is that unions and labor, however we say it, it's incredibly popular right now, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. And so I don't think we have to make the distinction anymore. The fact of the matter is that polling shows that unions are more popular right now than they've been, pretty much at any time since the Great Depression. And so there is simply no question that if you remove the barriers to labor organizing, I mean, we would look like Scandinavia. Right, we would have, we'd have unionization all over the place. I write a lot, and I'm working on a book project involving Iceland, and so I'm up in Iceland quite a bit. In Iceland, everybody's in a union.
Oh yeah.
I literally went to see the Northern Lights, right, on a boat. Right, we go out on a boat at night, into the harbor to see the Northern Lights. It's, take a break from writing, go, actually look at nature. So I'm out to see the Northern Lights. I'm talking to the people on the boat. I said, this is, what's this like? Blah, blah, blah. and they're all in a union. The people who like take you out to look at the sky are in unions. Everybody who drives over, and they go, oh well, according to a Scott Walker or a Ron DeSantis or somebody like that, that would mean the end of everything, right? Wrong.
It's socialism.
It's a fully functional society, right? It's a very successful society, and everybody's in a union. Now, if we remove the barriers to union organizing in the United States, would everyone be in the union in the U.S.? Maybe not. I don't know. I'm not going to go to any prediction, but I can tell you the numbers would skyrocket. And when those numbers skyrocketed, that is where you would begin to see the transformation of states.
Yes.
Now, remember, we are a federal system, so our states are where a lot of stuff matters. And, since, for decades now, the southern states of the United States, right, which have some of the highest levels of poverty, right, are actually some of the most diverse states in the country, have not had strong unions. And what have you ended up with? You've ended up with a situation where they become extremely right-wing in their governance, right? That's who's in charge. Well, I invite you to think back a little bit on history. One of the things that Henry Wallace, and I'm not going to keep referencing Henry Wallace here, but
it's all good. I'm a big fan.
But one of the things that Henry Wallace was very supportive of was something called Operation Dixie. This was an effort by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, in the immediate aftermath of World War II to send organizers throughout the South to organize multiracial unions, right? To say, we're going to not divide people up. We are going to unite people against the bosses, right? And we're going to organize in the states all over the South. Well, what was the reaction to that? Southern Democrats Southern segregationist Democrats joined with Republicans to pass the Taft-Hartley Act to put all the barriers in the way of organizing unions, right? Mm-hmm. So we ended up in a situation where in the immediate aftermath of World War II, when you had this vision for, really going into the South, organizing people along economic lines, but knocking down those racial barriers and saying people can actually unite together to get better pay, better circumstance, better, future for themselves. That was a transformational moment. It had tremendous potential, and yet it was blocked. Barriers were put in place. And you guys, those barriers still exist to this day.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.